Part 1 Introduction. The vampire is a cryptid that has haunted the imagination of humanity for centuries. Cultures around the world all have variations of the undead that sustains itself on human blood. In the current zeitgeist, the vampire continues to be a popular figure in our media. In the late 2000s, franchises like Twilight pushed another wave of vampires into the mainstream, with shows like Vampire Diaries and True Blood. In 2026, we still have a steady stream of vampire content. This includes Interview with a Vampire, the new TV series that came out in 2022, What We Do in the Shadows, and Sinners. The latter won multiple Oscars last year in 2025 for its original screenplay, score, and best performance from its actor, Michael B. Jordan. What continues to draw us to the figure of the vampire? In this video essay, I'll explore some of the staples of the vampire genre and how its evolution reflects our current fears and beliefs. I will give a spoiler warning for these movies, mild spoilers for Twilight, and more serious story spoilers for Bram Stoker's Dracula 1992 and Interview with a Vampire 1994. Pop culture adaptations. I've had an interest in vampires since I was 11 years old. My first exposure was reading the Twilight series. What initially drew me into the series was the main protagonist, Bella. Both she and I shared the experience of leaving a sunny place, me, California, her, Arizona, to move to dreary Washington state. I was endlessly fascinated with the lore of Stephenie Meyer's vampires. They deviate substantially from traditional vampires. Some have supernatural powers like mind control and the ability to see in the future. They also have supernatural strength, beauty, and they're immortal. They're not weak to garlic, sunlight, steaks, or silver. Most famously of all, their skin glitters or effervesces, if you will, in the sun. I've read all the books, seen the movies, and have even visited Forks, Washington. I'll put some pictures up above. To continue my vampire obsession, I watched The Vampire Diaries, which is a TV series, What We Do in the Shadows, and First Kill, which sadly only ran for one season. I love the stories that explore what it entails to become a monster that must take life in order to survive. And in romantic stories, there's a constant push and pull between the human and the vampire. The vampire has to put away their predatory instincts in order to engage safely with their human counterpart. Usually these stories end with the vampire also becoming a vampire, so they can live eternally with their partner. Since I've primarily watched movies and TV shows about vampires that have been produced within the last 2 decades, I had a curiosity in what older adaptations of the vampire look like and how they have evolved to their current form. I decided to focus on Dracula and Interview with a Vampire because they're staples in the genre and are also often referred to as quintessential vampire media. There are 2 stories that come up the most when I was doing preliminary research into the cultural ties of vampires. European origins. Most modern stories that feature vampires often take inspiration from Eastern European folklore. The vampire is characterized as either an outside or a member of the community that was shunned. They mainly traverse at night to attack and feed on the blood of their victims. In some variation, the undead is able to change form into animals such as bats, wolves, and even exercise control over these same species. The depiction of the vampire was told to explain the dangers of a stranger to a community and the diseases they could potentially bring. The ways to ward off vampires include using garlic, salt, holy water, and silver to ward them off. The stories that were told usually followed the same narrative structure. It would begin with strange occurrences happening in town, such as people acting strange or finding mysterious bite wounds on their bodies. They'd usually seek help from a Catholic priest who would tell them this must be the work of a vampire. He would usually point them towards a newcomer in town whose appearance would usually coincide with the beginning of these strange occurrences. Another possibility is checking the local cemetery to find a disturbed grave. Within the grave, the corpse would appear to still be alive with longer fingernails and not appear to be decomposed. Also, in Eastern Europe, it was common for bodies at this time to be buried with a funeral shroud, which is a piece of white cloth that is placed over a dead body in lieu of something like a coffin to bury a body. An Eton funeral shroud was another sign that the corpse was a member of the undead. The story usually ended with the demise of the vampire. To get rid of the vampire, the body could be sprinkled in holy water to get rid of the unholy spirit, because usually there were beliefs in Slavic culture that the soul was heavily connected to the body, and the vampire was kind of a corruption of the soul that did not leave when the body died, hence them being called the undead. And so through use of like holy rituals, the body could be free from this purgatory and either go to the afterlife in heaven or hell. Vampires were usually associated with disease, with vampire being a diagnosis for someone who had contracted the curse of becoming a vampire, either through dying in sin. This can include dying by suicide or just generally living an unholy life, like being a drunk, or being bitten by a vampire. Corpses during this time were often dug up during disease outbreaks and burned or had parts removed out of fear they were vampires that brought diseases into the community. Part 2, Dracula. Historical context. By the end of the 1800s, syphilis had become widespread across London. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease that has caused the afflicted to be covered in sores and lesions. Not a good time. It carried a high stigma, being associated with poverty and prostitution. This is due to poorer areas of the city usually suffering from overcrowding and abysmal sanitation. These conditions were apt for the spread of disease. Additionally, women who had no money for food or shelter were forced to work in brothels in order to house or clothe themselves because they did not have access to many jobs in this era. They were considered dirty and impure for working in sex work, but it beat the alternative of starving on the street. Women whose husbands contracted the disease were not even required to be informed of their husband's diagnosis. Men were incentivized to hide when they found out they had syphilis because it could expose their infidelity and interactions with prostitutes. There was a moral disgrace placed on those afflicted, which in turn forced those who had the disease to not reveal it to family or their sexual partners. This could potentially put unborn babies in danger, since pregnant women can give the illness to their fetuses. This can result in a baby being born with congenital syphilis, which had a kind of a high mortality rate at this time. About 30% of fetuses born with congenital syphilis died before birth. It wouldn't be until 1928, with the invention of penicillin, that there would be a cure, which is why we do not really hear about it much in the modern era. It's in this cultural context that Dracula was written and published. Story summary. The story of Dracula follows the law clerk Jonathan and his fiancée Mina. Jonathan travels to Transylvania to meet Dracula's estate and finalize the purchase of multiple properties in London. While Jonathan is in the castle, Dracula spots a picture of his fiancée. This picture reminds Dracula of his long-lost lover, Elizabeth. In 1462, during the fall of Constantinople, Dracula was a soldier, and while returning to the battlefield, discovered his lover, Elizabeth, had committed suicide due to receiving false news of his death. The priest informs him that due to her sin, she is destined for hell, and Dracula in response shuns the church and drinks tainted blood that turns him into a vampire. He travels to London to find Mina. Jonathan is trapped in the castle with Dracula's 3 vampire wives, who suck his life force. During the day, he appears as a well-dressed gentleman, but at night he takes on a ghastly appearance. While courting Mina, he bites her friend Lucy, who is a rich aristocrat. Lucy's suitors work with Van Helsing, who discovers Lucy has vampirism and kills her. Dracula turns Mina into a vampire as well. A final showdown occurs with the suitors, Van Helsing and Dracula.
He and caress me, my darling husband, please.
Holy blood! We're strong in the Lord! In the power of his might! We're strong in the Lord! In the power of his might! The power of God is upon us! We're strong in the Lord and the power of his might! We're strong in the Lord and the power of his might!
Mina drives a knife through his heart, which allows him to return to the afterlife with Elizabeth and frees Mina from the curse of vampirism. Analysis. The character of Dracula can be seen as an allegory for disease, specifically, in this case, syphilis. The tale of Dracula is particularly erotic, with his vampire brides being shown nude and seducing Jonathan before attacking him. Dracula attacks his victims by biting them on the neck, a particularly sensual place for a bite as compared to the hand or leg. This eroticism fits well with syphilis, since usually it's contracted through sexual encounters and can be spread through contaminated blood. There are even references to the disease in the film, with Van Helsing informing other doctors of its harm.
In fact, civilization and civilization have advanced together.
Dracula's ability to shapeshift into bats, wolves, and rats also lends this narrative interpretation. Rats and bats are common vectors for disease. They were highly prevalent in urban London, especially in areas with high rates of poor sanitation and overcrowding. At this time, syphilis carried a high social stigma since it was associated with prostitution. Nina's short-lived romance with Dracula represents her sexual desires that would have been frowned upon for a lady to openly flaunt in Victorian society. Her husband Jonathan represents a safe path, marrying a man in a respectable career and performing wifely duties. He is the middle-class dream that will keep her pure and virtuous. Her slaying Dracula is a rejection of this desire, instead choosing to stay with Jonathan and conform to the expectations of the day. She is seen as a hero for opting for moral purity instead of embracing her own sexual desires. However, this allegory falls short because women still face potentially getting the disease if their husbands were unfaithful or engaged with sex workers. In a way, it's Mina who is trapped. On either path, she still incurs the risk of becoming morally impure. Staying with Jonathan allows her to present as she should be, but it will not save her from potentially getting a dangerous disease that she could pass on to future children. Part 3. Interview with a Vampire. Historical context. In the 70s and 80s, the HIV/AIDS pandemic swept through the United States. HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. Like its name suggests, the main symptoms of this disease include a weakened immune system. This is due to the illness destroying T cells in the immune system, weakening the body's ability to respond to disease. This means that even catching a relatively harmless illness like the flu can send someone with HIV to the hospital. If left untreated, the disease progresses into AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, the final stage of the disease. In this final stage, the body has a severely low white blood cell count, which makes it a much stronger likelihood of succumbing to your illness. Similar to syphilis, it was mainly disseminated through sexual contact where fluids were exchanged. Due to it spreading more easily between men, it was dominantly contracted by gay men. This made it hard to get funding for research and finding a cure because the main people who it affected were those in the queer community. This caused a lot of misinformation surrounding the disease, leading people to shun those who were diagnosed out of fear of catching it. Another reason for this was at that time there was heavy discrimination against people who were queer, so a diagnosis is a potential for outing you as a member of that community. Story summary. Interview with a Vampire features two protagonists, Louis and Lestat. Lestat transforms Louis, a disillusioned plantation owner living in New Orleans who is bored with his life. As a vampire, he enjoys immortality, but he struggles to sustain himself on human blood. While Lestat mainly preys on women of the upper class, Louis sticks to draining the blood of chickens and poodles. Lestat keeps pressuring Louis to drink human blood, but he refuses to. At one point, both men enter a camp filled with plague victims and happen upon a little girl, Claudia, whose mother has just died. Louis feeds on her, but due to the amount of blood he draws, she is at risk of dying, and so Lestat chooses to turn Claudia into a vampire to keep Louise with him. Since Claudia was a child when she's turned, she's eternally stuck as a child. This means as her mind continues to mature, she is stuck in the same body as when she was turned. This causes her to grow resentment with Lestat, and she and Louis create a murder plot to kill him.
But it wasn't always so. I had a mother once, and Louis, he had a wife. He was mortal, the same as she, and so was I.
Claudia,
You made us what we are, didn't you?
At first, Claudia tricks him into drinking the blood of two boys whose blood she has poisoned. Lestat becomes weakened and they throw him into a swamp. He ends up coming back. He sucked on the blood of crocodiles and other swamp creatures to regain his strength, and they set him on fire. At this point, they truly believe he's dead and promptly embark to Europe. In Paris, they meet a troupe of vampires who put on plays for humans. One of the members learns of their murder of Lestat, and they are promptly tortured. Louise manages to break out of prison, but he is too late to save Claudia, who has been burned to death by sunlight. In revenge, he burns down the theater and leaves. After wandering alone for decades, he comes back to Louisiana. He finds Lestat again, who happens to be alive. He asks him to join him, and Louise rejects his offer.
You've come home to me then? You remember how I was? The vampire that I was.
Yes, I remember.
No one could refuse me. Not even you, Louis.
I tried.
Yes, you tried. And the more you tried, the more I wanted you.
The entire story is told as an interview that Louis is having with a reporter with, as the title says, his life as a vampire. The reporter asks him to become a vampire, and Louis kicks him out. While the reporter is driving away, he's attacked by Lestat in his convertible, and that is where the story ends. Analysis. Similar to Dracula, the vampires of the story also represent disease. Louis and Lestat's relationship status is never confirmed, but there are implications that they are queer. They have a close bond, and Louis is different from other victims of Lestat, who usually kill and drinks the blood of women. But it's Louise that he offers the chance to become a vampire and live with him. When Claudia's turn, she fits into their family dynamic like an adopted daughter. Lestat teaches her the ways of being vampires and other skills like learning to play the piano. He serves as a mentor role for her like a father. Each vampire represents an aspect of HIV. Claudia is the life stolen from those afflicted. Before there's adequate medical knowledge, hundreds of thousands of people die due to the high mortality rate without treatment. She herself in the story is a victim of disease, with her mother being killed of plague, and that is where she is turned into a vampire. Lestat represents the high virulence of the disease, especially before it was known that it was spread through infected blood. He turns many characters in the story into vampires, and he also kills a lot of characters. Louis represents the discrimination that altered the lives of the many victims of the disease and the isolation by everyone around them. Part 4. Conclusion. As our analysis has found, vampires represent the fears and moral panics of a culture. As different diseases and social expectations continue to fluctuate through history, so do our understanding of it in art. In both stories I analyzed, the people who were victims to diseases were often also those who were part of minority groups that faced heavy discrimination, such as sex workers and queer people. The myth of the vampire represents what we are scared to catch and what will ostracize us from our own communities. The medical fields have made many strides in the last 2 centuries, from the creation of germ theory to the prevalence of vaccinations. Through this change, the vampire has also evolved to be a more sympathetic character, going from a terrifying villain to a sort of anti-hero. The depiction of vampires has softened as we've become more accepting as a society. The purpose of the vampire has also changed significantly. Instead of serving as a cautionary moral tale about the pitfalls of being immoral, the vampire now acts as a lighter form of entertainment. We are still making stories that contain the undead as the monster, but the mainstream has mainly adopted the vampire as a supernatural romantic partner, one who protects the human protagonist from other threats instead of being the one putting them in danger. As we continue to see new depictions of the vampire, we should continue to ask ourselves what the vampire is representing and what our prejudices are.